So, like many of us, when I was in high school, I was made to read Romeo and Juliet because apparently that's something you're supposed to do. And the only thing I remember only two things about this assignment. One is one day we had a substitute teacher in that class. So instead of reading the book, she just showed us the movie. And any day you get to watch a movie is a good thing. What made it even more interesting was she was apparently unaware that the movie that we got from the library was a version of the movie that has a small scene of partial nudity in it, which is quite a thing when you're a junior in high school and not used to seeing such things in school. I'm not sure if anybody let the school board know that happened back then. Today, I'm sure we would know. All right. But when we were reading Romeo and Juliet, and admittedly it took me a while to kind of get into the story, a question kept coming up to me, which is, first and foremost, why are these two families fighting? What is it about the Montagues and the Capulets that they don't like each other? Because whatever is going on between them had happened long enough at this point that multiple generations of the family were now involved, so much so that even their servants are now involved. And so if you remember Romeo and Juliet at all, you know in the beginning of it, two of the servants from the two houses get into it with each other, and somebody ends up dead. So I've often wondered, and I wondered at the time, why it is that these two families were so mad at each other. What feud existed between them that they were willing to go this far and as far as they did? And I was told over and over again by my high school English teacher that wasn't the point. Well, it was the point as far as I was concerned, because I really wanted to know, and she informed me that you can want to know that all you want, but you just can make up something in your head. So I did, and I tried to talk her into an assignment where, can I just write all the backstory to all of this? Like, that's what I want to do. I want to know what's going on. We need a prequel, to this guy. And she's like, no. I'm like, fine. But it's just one of those things. And what's funny is, when we read that story, most of us are okay with it. Shakespeare didn't actually think it was important to tell us why these two families were so mad at each other over what and for how long. We were just supposed to take it as a given that it was so, and apparently, since, here we are 300-400 years later still reading that play, nobody along the way really had a big problem with this. And they didn't have a big problem with it because these things happen, right? There are times when people decide, when one group of people, whether that be a family or a country or whatever it is, there are times when one group of people decides they don't like another group of people, and that other group of people decides that the feeling is mutual, right? And we end up in these situations that we often think about or talk about as this idea of a feud, right? So there's a feud that existed between these two families that unfortunately throughout the story cost these two young people their lives and led to this story that we still go today. We are so comfortable with the idea of a feud that there are groups that dislike each other this much that we don't even need to know why it is that they do. And of course, this doesn't just happen in literature. It happens in real life too. If you are like me, a fan of history, especially like American history and history of the West, one of the things that comes up a lot, there's been a lot of movies made about it, that comes a lot is the fight at the OK Corral, right? It's something that we all kind of at least know a little bit about, right? We know that Wyatt Earp was somehow involved, and we know there's other people that were involved, and that it is something that had happened. Most of us likely don't know why it is that it happened, or if we do know why it is that it happened, we know that because we saw it in a movie, because it makes for a pretty good movie. Though actually not really, because the actual gunfight lasted about 2.5 minutes, and movies need to be longer than that, right? So they give us all this build-up and stuff. But the truth is, I mean, the actual truth behind, that famous moment in the Western American history is that there were two families, the Earps and the Clantons, and at least a little bit, the Earp clan was kind of on the side of law and order, and the Clantons were a little bit kind of outlaws, but also not really, and it was really kind of muddy in between. And really what this was two families who had a different view of the world, who decided they didn't like each other, and went and started to argue with each other, and it escalated to the point where there was actual gunfight at a particular corral. Nobody actually even really knows. History doesn't actually record what it was that actually started this beef, but over time it just grew, and these two families, the Earps and the Clantons, ended up settling it in a way most of us would hopefully never settle something. Now, of course, the most famous examples of family feuds in American history would be the Hatfields and the McCoys, absolutely. So you have the Hatfields and you've got the McCoys. You've got the Hatfields, from West Virginia. You have the McCoys from Kentucky, and at least there's at least a little bit of background that we kind of know about this one. The Hatfields were on the Confederate side of the cause. The McCoys were on the Union side, so that was a piece of it. There apparently was an argument about a pig at one point. If you've seen the miniseries that I think somebody did, they bring that up in there. But for whatever reason, these two families end up starting off disliking each other and end up escalating things to a point where it is still remembered today almost as like a folk story, as one of the most recognizable ideas of a feud between two people. Now, actually, during the feud actually happened. There's actually a Romeo and Juliet type subplot that runs throughout this. Because there was a Roseanne McCoy who, during this time, actually fell in love with a Jonesy Hatfield. Ooh. And she actually left her clan to go and live with the Hatfields, which didn't set well with anybody. That's also where, and the similarities sort of end right there, because it turns out Jonesy was not a particularly nice guy, and after getting Roseanne pregnant, decides that he doesn't actually want to marry her, and she ends up marrying one of his brothers instead. It was the time. So later, actually, because of all of this, the elder Hatfield actually killed one of the brothers, who then himself was then killed by a McCoy mob. Great. Feuds happen. This kind of animosity can happen. It's something that for some reason we are capable of, and we just know that it happens. We don't often know why we are fighting. We don't often know why groups don't like each other. And oftentimes it doesn't even matter why, because once we are indoctrinated into one side or another, that's where we are going to be. Now, you're asking yourself, Pastor Jeremy, it's Mother's Day. What are you talking about? Which is fair. All right, this is what we're talking about. Today we are meeting the main antagonist in our story of Esther. And we've already met one of the other main characters, which is Mordecai. Last week, we talked about the idea that one of the only identifying informations we have about Mordecai is that Mordecai was part of the group that was associated with King Saul back in the day. That's what we know. And the Scripture is very, very clear about that. And anybody reading this, especially at the time, would know that that was the case, that Mordecai was associated with King Saul back in the day. So now when Haman is introduced, kind of out of nowhere, we're really not told much about him at all, except where he's from. So he is Haman, who is identified as an Agagite. And now you're all thinking, well, of course, that makes perfect sense now. He's an Agagite, whoever they are. Well, who they are is the people that Saul went to war with and eventually defeated. So there was a time before the time of Haman and Mordecai, where their ancestors, several centuries before, were engaged in conflict with each other. These are things that are not easily forgotten and things that people remember. And no doubt, we are introduced to Haman in the way we are introduced to him so that we will know that Mordecai and Haman sit on different sides of the line. They sit in different families. They are clearly in the different camps in the feud that continues to exist between God's people and the people around them. Add into this, at the beginning of today's passage, you read, after these things, Haman was promoted. If you were a good, diligent person and read all of chapter 2 last week, which of course you didn't read in church, you know that chapter 2 ended with a small little plot against the king, which happened all the time. Basically, people used to plot against kings all the time. Well, there was a plot against the king at the end of chapter 2 that Mordecai became aware of because Mordecai likes to hang out at the gates in front of the palace, which means that if he's hanging out there and he's in one of those places, he is an important person. He is probably part of the royal court. He is probably somebody of esteem within the organization. He is probably somebody who is known and is important in that world. So Mordecai becomes aware of this plot to overthrow the king. He feeds that through Esther and says, Esther, you need to tell them. So Esther tells them in the name, this is important, in the name of Mordecai, Esther lets the king know that there's this plot against him. The king figures this out and says, okay, he goes, the people confess, they're dealt with, and end of scene. Nothing, even though the king knows it was Mordecai who saved his life and uncovered this plot, nothing is done for or to Mordecai. And then we hear right at the beginning of chapter 3, after these things, basically after all of that transpired, after Mordecai saves the king's life, Haman, a member of the other family, the other clan, the other side of the feud, Haman is promoted. Haman is promoted to be with the king. The reason this is important is for a lot of reasons, as it sets up a lot of what happens moving forward. But it also explains why Haman has this crazy reaction to Mordecai refusing to bow down to him. Now, for a couple of things are important here. There is nothing in Jewish law that says that Haman can't do that. There's nothing in there that says Haman is not allowed to show reverence to, or that Mordecai is not allowed to show reverence to Haman should he want to. This is something he is just doing of his own accord and is no doubt doing it for all the reasons we just talked about. So Mordecai's mad. He's probably feeling left out and behind, and he doesn't like that somebody who's a member of the other group got promoted over him. And so when Haman finds out about this, Haman has what is probably the most disproportionate response you would ever heard of in the Bible, right? Or heard of, period, right? So here he is, oh, that person over there is being mean to me. Let's just get rid of all of them, right? This is a disproportionate response that makes absolutely no sense unless you know the history behind it. So here is Haman and Mordecai representing the two sides, the two opposing factions. Mordecai is no doubt upset about what had happened, and here Haman has finally an excuse to get rid of that other group that he's no doubt wanted to get rid of for most of his life and everybody behind him. We've stumbled into a family feud, and I don't mean that fun game show from the 90s, which is a good show. Is it still on? Oh, it is? Oh, man. I got to watch some Family Feud. All right. So that's where this comes from, right? So when you think about it, and when we progress forward and we, there's a question that ought to be asked now that these things have been set in motion. We knew that God's people would be in trouble. We knew the Jews would be in trouble. We know Esther has to save them, but we're not sure where the trouble came from. Well, the trouble comes from here, and the trouble comes from the fact that there is this old, long-standing rivalry that nobody has ever dealt with. We as people are prone to falling into these sorts of situations. We as people are prone to falling into these sorts of feuds in big and small ways. Now, if you are like me, you are saying, I don't have any feuds like that, and I'm glad that you don't, right? And in fact, most of us don't. Most of us are not going to get into a Capulet and Montague level disagreement with some other family over our honor or whatever it is that we're supposed to be fighting about. That's not how things tend to work. But it doesn't mean that we aren't sometimes prone to a smaller, perhaps more innocent feeling version of this. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to actually go a little further back to school, because apparently I want to tell stories about school today. I don't know. And when we first moved to Montana, I was in 4th grade. And one of the things we had to do in 4th grade was we had to pick a state and do like a report and a project based on that state, including we got to make the state out of clay, which I thought was the best part of the whole deal. And I chose Oregon. Now, I'd never been to Oregon at this point. I didn't know anything about Oregon at the time, but I had to make my little model of the state and gather up all the information about the state and get little things and make a poster board like you do, and do all that fun stuff that I like doing. And as is often the case with school projects, it became a bit of a last-minute dash, right? As I had conveniently, somewhat interestingly, forgot when the due date was until a couple of days before. So we were around our house and we were getting this all put together. This is how I remember it. I'm sure others in my house might disagree, but I'm getting this all put together, and we're trying to find all these things that we could have and put into it. This is before the internet, so you can't just go online and print out pictures. You actually have to have stuff and books. And so I'm trying to find all of these things, and about right as we're kind of wrapping up and I'm trying to find the last few things, my mom finally looks at me and she's like, "Why didn't you just pick California? We moved here from California. We have a lot of stuff from California. We could be done with this. If you had just picked California, why did you pick Oregon?" And of course, what I'm thinking to myself at that time is, even in 4th grade, in the late 80s, in Montana, I know it's not a good thing to tell people you're from California. We didn't have memes back then, but if we did, they'd probably look something like this one right here. That literally came from my friend's Facebook feed. All right. Actually, we had lived there for about 2 months. When somebody actually called to complain, we still had California license plates on our car. Now, the truth is, now it's interesting, of course, I claim to be, and actually, of my family, I'm the only one that actually claims to be from Montana. Everybody else, got out as fast as they could. Some of us drank the Kool-Aid and decided to stay, and discovered that it is a beautiful and wonderful place that it is. It is, I will say, convenient, by the way, to be able to say when you move to Colorado, you move from Montana, because people are much more understanding about that than some of the other places. So, people often ask me, how's Colorado? I'm like, Colorado's Montana with a lot more people. That's not a good thing. All right. Now, I shouldn't say, and so this stuff kind of shows up in all sorts of ways. Now, I should tell you that I really enjoyed and liked growing up in Montana. And we had a good time in Montana. One of the things that we loved to do when we lived in Montana is we liked to tell jokes. Anybody want to hear a joke? So when you grow up in eastern Montana, you learn to tell jokes. You learn to tell jokes like, how do you know the toothbrush was invented in North Dakota? Because if it was invented anywhere else, we'd call it a teeth brush. Wait for it. You also learn jokes like, what does the North Dakota State grad call the Montana State grad? Boss. And then there's some nice pretty ones with pictures. There's this one with picture. I like this one. This is the state tree of North Dakota. Now, my understanding is if you live in Wisconsin, you tell Minnesota jokes. Where do we tell Nebraska jokes in Colorado? What do we tell? They're not even like, okay, yeah, there you go. We do these, right? And sometimes these things show up and they're fun, and that's okay. And it's easy, and of course it's easy when you grow up on eastern Montana. There's this idea, nobody fights like cousins. So when you grow up in the eastern plains of Montana, it's really fun to make fun of those poor saps who grew up in the western plains of South Dakota or North Dakota. We had it so much better on our big flat piece of ground than they had on their big flat piece of ground. But this stuff creeps in, right? The stereotypes creep in, right? The joke, they come in, and sometimes they're not big and flashy, and it's not people trying to kill each other or anything like that. Sometimes the way this stuff creeps into our lives is through the jokes and the humors that we tell. And oftentimes they are actually good natures, and we don't mean anything by it, and it is just having fun. And I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that. But the thing we have to be mindful of is that as people, and as humans, we are prone to stereotyping. Partly because it just makes life easier, right? It just makes life easier. If we have to think about everything all the time on an individual basis, that just feels so overwhelming. But the problem with this is that sometimes in the church we talk about this idea that while each of us is made in God's image and one of God's beloved children, which is absolutely true, all of us also carries around some brokenness in us. All of us carries around things in us that are not as they should be. And one of the places that our brokenness can get exploited is when we let the stereotypes in, and it becomes more than just a little good-natured humor. It becomes more than that. We don't often notice when we're letting into our lives the things that can be the seed of something that we don't intend to be there. We don't know really what laid at the heart of all of these feuds that happened throughout history and in literature. I'm guessing for many of them in the beginning it was something small, something that was let go, something that was ignored, that over time just builds up. We have to be careful, and we have to guard ourselves from living too much and taking too often the easy path of just assuming that this group of people is the way that they are, and our group of people is the way that they are, and this is the good people, and this is the bad people. If there's something that you have learned, we've already learned very clearly in the first 3 chapters of Esther, is that everything that's going to happen after, all the drama that's going to happen after, all the challenges that are going to happen after, would all be avoided if everybody was a little less quick to rush to judgment and got a little bit more curious about what was going on around them. We could have avoided all of the pain that happens from this point on if people weren't running around assuming they already knew everything they needed to know. We have the same challenge and the same opportunity today. We have to avoid assuming we already know everything we need to know about somebody because of where they came from or what they do or what they look like. That is not the path. That is not the faithful path, and that's not the path that God would have us on. Most of us will not and should not and hopefully will not get involved in any feuds that end in gunfights at corrals. Call me if you think it's getting that bad. I'll help you out. For most of us, it's about avoiding those smaller things, not letting those little things creep in, not letting those stereotypes define us and others in a way that we start doing harm. God gave us a pretty simple instructions. We are to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. Neighbor is not qualified. Neighbor is all of the neighbors, even the ones that annoy you and come from California, or went to the wrong school, or root for the wrong team, or voted for the wrong person. We are to love our neighbors how they are. And the benefit of that is we also get to love ourselves. Because you know what? Sometimes even we do the wrong thing, go to the wrong place, root for the wrong team. but we get to love ourselves anyway, like we get to love our neighbors anyway, like we get to love God anyway, because God loved us first. So while we enjoy the story of Esther, and while we enjoy all of the stuff that's going to come, let us not fall into the traps that they fell into. Let us not fall into the trap of knowing we know what's going on and assuming that this is the right group and the wrong group, and instead realize the truth, that we are all God's children, loved by God. We are all broken and yet loved anyway. And let us love each other the way that God loved us. Amen.